Before the story begins, place the map gently in the mind. The Volga runs from north to south past the city of Stalingrad before continuing toward the Caspian Sea. West of the city, the Don makes its great bend, approaching the Volga before turning away again. Between the two rivers lies open country crossed by roads, railways, villages, and shallow valleys. Farther southwest, the land opens toward the Caucasus. In the summer of 1942, this geography became the center of the largest land war in history. German forces had already been fighting in the Soviet Union for more than a year. They had advanced hundreds of kilometers, taken millions of prisoners, and occupied enormous territories. They had also failed to destroy the Soviet state. The war had become something larger than the campaign German planners originally imagined. Every army on the Eastern Front depended on systems behind the fighting line. Railways carried ammunition and food. Trucks moved fuel. Horses pulled guns and wagons. Engineers repaired bridges. Hospitals received wounded soldiers. Factories far from the battlefield replaced weapons that could not be repaired. Stalingrad would test all of those systems. This story follows the German Sixth Army and the formations around it. That perspective does not mean the campaign is being told as a celebration of the German war effort. Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in a war of conquest connected to occupation, racial persecution, mass murder, and the brutal treatment of civilians and prisoners. The military story belongs inside that larger reality. Nor will the story pretend that every soldier inside Sixth Army experienced the battle in the same way. A tank crew on the Steppe, an infantry company in a factory, a transport pilot approaching Pitomnik, and a wounded man waiting for evacuation occupied different worlds, even when the same map surrounded them. What connects them is the gradual narrowing of options. At the beginning, Sixth Army moved across open country as part of a great offensive. Then it crossed the Don. Then it entered Stalingrad. Then it became fixed in the city. Then the Soviet counteroffensive closed the roads behind it. Finally, the army that had traveled so far east found itself unable to travel west at all. The campaign can therefore be followed not only by dates and place names, but by movement. How far could the army move? How much fuel did it have? Which roads were still open? Could wounded men be evacuated? Could food arrive? Could commanders still choose between attacking, holding, and withdrawing? As the story continues, those questions become more important than the number of streets captured inside the city. The famous images of Stalingrad show ruins, snow, and exhausted soldiers. Yet the disaster did not begin in the snow. It began under a summer sky, when the German armies were still advancing and the city seemed like one more objective beyond the horizon. So begin not with the final surrender, but with distance. To the west are the railheads and supply bases. To the south are the Caucasus and the oil fields that helped shape German strategy. To the east is the Volga, and between the Don and the Volga, the road to Stalingrad is still open. In the summer of 1942, the German armies in the Soviet Union turned south again. The previous year had ended very differently from the way German planners had expected. Operation Barbarossa had opened with enormous advances, huge encirclements, and the destruction or capture of large Soviet forces. Yet the Soviet Union had not collapsed. Moscow had not fallen. The Red Army had survived, recovered, and counter-attacked through the winter. German formations that had expected a short campaign spent months fighting in snow, mud, and cold far from the borders from which they had begun. By the spring of 1942, the Eastern War had become a contest of distance, production, manpower, and logistics as much as maneuver. Germany still held vast territories, but it no longer possessed the resources to attack everywhere at once. Hitler and the German High Command therefore concentrated the main effort in the south. The new offensive, known as Case Blue, aimed toward the Don Basin, the Caucasus, and the oil fields that fed much of the Soviet war economy. Oil was central to the plan. Germany had always faced limits in fuel. A successful drive toward the Caucasus offered the possibility of denying Soviet access to major oil-producing regions while opening them, at least in theory, to German use. Yet the distances were immense. Every kilometer gained carried supply columns farther from repaired railheads. Every bridge and road became part of a chain that had to deliver ammunition, food, spare parts, and fuel forward while carrying wounded men and damaged vehicles back. Among the formations assigned to the southern offensive was the German Sixth Army. Its commander was General Friedrich Paulus, a staff officer by background who had taken command earlier that year. Paulus was not a flamboyant field commander in the style of some of the better-known German panzer generals. He was methodical, careful, and experienced in planning. The army he led was powerful, but it was also part of a larger operation whose objectives would soon pull German forces in different directions. Case Blue began at the end of June. German and Axis forces advanced across the open country of southern Russia. At first, the movement seemed to confirm the belief that the Red Army could again be forced into a rapid collapse. Soviet formations withdrew eastward, sometimes before the large encirclements German commanders hoped to create could close. The German advance continued, but the great prisoner columns of 1941 were not repeated on the same scale. The map itself encouraged ambition. To the southeast lay the Caucasus and its oil. To the east lay the great bend of the Don and, beyond it, the Volga. Along the Volga stood a long industrial city whose name had become familiar to the German command, Stalingrad. At first, the city was only one part of a much larger strategic problem. The Volga was a major transportation route. Oil and other supplies moved along it from the south toward Central Soviet regions. Stalingrad also contained factories and served as a communications center. Taking or neutralizing the city could protect the northern flank of a German drive into the Caucasus and interrupt Soviet movement along the river. But the offensive did not remain one simple movement. In July, Army Group South was divided. Army Group A moved toward the Caucasus. Army Group B, which included the Sixth Army, turned toward the Don and Stalingrad. The division of effort created two great advances, separated by increasing distance. German formations were still moving forward, but the operation now required the supply system to support objectives in widely different directions. This mattered because speed on a map could hide weakness underneath. A panzer division could move quickly when fuel arrived. Infantry could occupy ground when ammunition followed. But the farther the armies traveled, the more difficult it became to repair vehicles, replace worn tires, bring forward artillery shells, and keep every unit at the strength shown on an operational map. There was also a darker reality behind the military arrows. Germany's campaign in the Soviet Union was an aggressive war conducted within the policies of Nazi occupation. Civilians suffered under occupation, prisoners were treated brutally, and the campaign was connected to mass persecution and murder. A calm account of military operations cannot separate the movement of armies from the system in whose service those armies fought. For the soldiers of 6th Army, however, the immediate experience of the summer was movement. Columns rolled east through heat and dust. Engineers repaired crossings. Supply vehicles followed roads that had been damaged by retreating forces and previous battles. Headquarters shifted from one location to another as maps were updated and new orders arrived. The Don River curved across the path ahead. Beyond it lay the Steppe and the Volga. The farther the army advanced, the more the city of Stalingrad moved from the edge of planning toward the center. By late July, German directives gave the city increasing importance. The 6th Army would fight its way toward the Don, cross it, and move on Stalingrad. The 4th Panzer Army, whose direction had been altered during the summer, would also become involved in the approach to the city from the south. The result was an operation carrying more than one purpose at the same time. Stalingrad mattered because of the Volga. It mattered because of industry. It mattered because it guarded the northern side of the Caucasus operation. And, increasingly, it mattered because the city's name connected it personally to Joseph Stalin, giving the objective symbolic weight in Hitler's thinking. None of those reasons, by itself, explains everything that followed. Stalingrad did not become a disaster simply because of its name. The catastrophe grew from a chain of decisions about objectives, reserves, logistics, urban combat, flank security, and the refusal to give up ground after the operational situation had changed. In the first weeks of Case Blue, that future was still hidden. The German armies were advancing. The Soviet armies were withdrawing. The summer roads remained open, and the front appeared to move east almost every day. For 6th Army, Stalingrad was still a destination on a map. Before the year ended, it would become a pocket from which the army could not escape. The decision to concentrate in the south also reflected what Germany could no longer do. In 1941, 3 great army groups had attacked toward Leningrad, Moscow, and Ukraine at the same time. By 1942, losses and equipment shortages made another offensive on that scale impossible. The German army still had powerful formations, but many divisions had never fully replaced the men and vehicles lost during the first winter. The Soviet Union had suffered far greater losses in absolute numbers, yet its capacity to raise new formations continued to surprise German intelligence. Industry had been moved east. New tanks and aircraft left factories beyond the reach of most German bombers. Soldiers arrived from regions that German planners had underestimated when calculating the manpower available to the Soviet state. This imbalance between expectation and reality affected every later decision. German commanders often judged the Red Army by the destruction already inflicted upon it. Soviet commanders increasingly judged the war by the armies still available and the time required to rebuild them. The southern offensive also depended on coalition forces. Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies helped hold sectors that Germany did not have enough divisions to cover alone. Their contribution was essential, but the alliance did not create identical armies. Equipment varied, communications procedures differed. Some formations had modern weapons, while others relied on older artillery and anti-tank guns. German planners often expected these Allied armies to hold broad fronts, while the strongest German formations concentrated for offensive operations. That arrangement was not automatically fatal. A quiet sector could be held by fewer troops if reserves stood close enough to respond. The danger came when quiet sectors became the main target of a Soviet offensive and those reserves were committed somewhere else. In the summer, that danger still seemed distant. The important question was how quickly Case Blue could reach its objectives. Hitler's headquarters issued orders that changed priorities as the offensive developed. Units were redirected, army boundaries shifted. 4th Panzer Army, for example, was first sent southward and later turned back towards Stalingrad. Each change had operational reasons, but every change also consumed time and fuel. A division does not change direction by moving a symbol on a map. Columns must turn, traffic routes must be reassigned, supply points must be moved, and headquarters must establish new communication. These frictions did not stop the offensive, but they reduced the margin available for later problems. The campaign that followed would repeatedly show how a strong army can become vulnerable not because one part fails completely, but because many small margins disappear at once. The road to Stalingrad crossed a landscape that could look almost empty on a military map. The steppe spread beneath a wide summer sky. Villages were separated by long distances. Roads were often little more than tracks. In dry weather, columns raised dust that settled over vehicles, weapons, clothing, and food. In rain, the same routes could become heavy and slow. For an army moving east, the apparent emptiness was misleading. Every kilometer had to be supplied. A German infantry division consumed food, ammunition, medical stores, fuel for its vehicles, and replacement equipment. A panzer division demanded still more fuel and maintenance. Tanks that were not destroyed in battle could be lost temporarily to mechanical failure. Engines overheated, tracks wore down. Trucks broke springs, punctured tires, and needed parts that might be hundreds of kilometers behind the front. The German army depended heavily on railways for long-distance supply. But Soviet railways used a different gauge from the German system. Tracks had to be converted before trains could move efficiently into newly occupied territory. Bridges had to be repaired. Stations had to be organized. Until railheads advanced, trucks and horse-drawn transport carried the burden over increasingly long roads. The summer offensive, therefore, became a race between the fighting units and their logistical foundation. When fuel arrived, armored columns could move rapidly. When it did not, The front could pause even in the absence of strong enemy resistance. Ammunition had to compete with food and fuel for transport. Spare parts competed with replacements. The same truck that carried shells forward might be expected to carry wounded men back. Sixth Army advanced toward the Don while Soviet forces tried to avoid being trapped west of the river. German commanders repeatedly attempted to create encirclements, but the Soviet command was increasingly willing to give up ground rather than repeat the gigantic losses of the previous year. That did not make the retreat orderly everywhere. Soviet formations still suffered heavily, but the pattern frustrated the German expectation that operational movement would quickly destroy the enemy army. The farther east Sixth Army went, the less useful a simple measurement of distance became. Capturing another village might move the front 10 kilometers, but it could also lengthen the supply route by 10 kilometers. Crossing a river might open the next phase of the advance, but it also created a new bridge that engineers had to maintain and protect. The German command was trying to sustain pressure in several directions at once. Army Group A moved into the Caucasus. Other forces covered the growing flank along the Don. Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies increasingly occupied long sectors that German divisions could not hold themselves. This coalition made the scale of the offensive possible, but equipment, doctrine, anti-tank strength, training, and supply varied greatly between formations. For Sixth Army, the immediate obstacle was the Don Bend. Soviet forces defended approaches to crossings and gathered reserves east of the river. The fighting during July and August slowed the German timetable. Units that had seemed to be chasing a retreating enemy now had to attack prepared or rapidly organized positions. The heat added its own pressure. Dust reduced visibility along roads and damaged machinery. Water mattered to men, horses, and engines. Supply columns became long and vulnerable. A vehicle disabled in the wrong place could block traffic behind it. Military, police, and traffic control units worked to keep movement from collapsing into congestion. At headquarters, these details appeared as tonnage, fuel states, vehicle counts, and estimated arrival times. At the level of a company, they appeared more simply. A truck did not arrive. A tank remained in repair. A ration issue was delayed. A platoon received less ammunition than expected. None of these events necessarily stopped an army, but together they shaped what the army could do next. The speed of the advance also created an intelligence problem. Maps changed faster than information could be confirmed. Soviet units disappeared from one sector and reappeared elsewhere. Air reconnaissance could identify columns, but it could not always determine their strength or destination. German staffs often believed the Red Army was nearer exhaustion than it actually was. This belief mattered. If the opponent was collapsing, then risk could be accepted. Flanks could be held more lightly. Reserves could be committed to the city. A pause to rebuild the logistical system might appear unnecessary when victory seemed close. Yet Soviet resistance continued. New formations arrived. The Volga provided a route by which men and supplies could move towards Stalingrad from the east. The city itself, long and narrow along the western bank, offered industrial structures, ravines, railway embankments, apartment districts, and factory complexes that would later break attacking formations into smaller pieces. None of that terrain was visible to soldiers still west of the Don. Their world was the steppe, the river crossings, the roads, and the distant horizon. By early August, 6th Army was fighting toward the Great Bend near Kalak. The German plan required the army to force the Don and then turn east through the corridor towards Stalingrad. The 4th Panzer Army approached from the south. On paper, the movement suggested a converging attack that might isolate Soviet forces west of the Volga. But time had been spent. Vehicles had been worn down, infantry had taken casualties. Supply distances had grown. The German army was still tactically dangerous, yet its freedom of action was narrowing, even as the map showed continued advance. This contradiction would define much of the Stalingrad campaign. Local success remained possible. German units could seize a ridge, cross a river, capture a district, or destroy a defensive position. But each success consumed strength, and the operational return grew smaller. The road across the steppe did not lead directly from victory to victory. It led from one demand to the next. Fuel had to reach the tanks. Artillery had to cross the river. Infantry had to catch up. Railways had to be converted. Bridges had to remain open. Allied armies had to hold the expanding flanks. In August, those requirements still seemed manageable. By November, the entire fate of 6th Army would depend on whether the system behind it had been strong enough. Stalingrad stretched for many kilometers along the western bank of the Volga. It was not a compact medieval city with one central fortress. It was a long industrial settlement shaped by the river, rail lines, workers' districts, factories, gullies, and open ground. Its importance in 1942 came from more than its name. The Volga was one of the Soviet Union's great transport arteries. Barges and ships moved oil, grain, raw materials, and other supplies along the river. Traffic from the Caucasus and lower Volga region could pass north toward central Soviet areas. German possession of the western bank at Stalingrad would threaten that route and make movement on the river far more difficult. The city also contained major industrial plants. The Stalingrad tractor factory, the Red October steel works, and the Barricade ordnance complex had been part of Soviet industrial production. Even as the front approached, industrial areas could support military activity and provide large buildings capable of becoming defensive positions. From the perspective of the German southern offensive, Stalingrad also stood near the northern side of the route into the Caucasus. If the city and the Volga crossing area remained strongly in Soviet hands, the northern flank of Army Group A's advance could never be considered secure. These practical reasons explain why Stalingrad mattered. But during July and August, the objective changed in character. German directives increasingly emphasized taking the city itself. Hitler's attention focused on the Volga and on Stalingrad as a named objective. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. A city bearing Stalin's name offered propaganda value. Yet reducing the campaign to a contest between two dictators misses the operational problem. Even a city with another name would have mattered because of where it stood. The danger came from allowing several objectives to reinforce one another until withdrawal became politically and psychologically difficult. The city was a transportation objective, an industrial objective, a flank security objective, and a symbolic objective at the same time. Every reason to attack it became another reason not to leave it. For Sixth Army, the mission, therefore, grew more specific. It was no longer enough to approach the Volga somewhere near Stalingrad. The army was expected to break Soviet forces, defending the area and take the city. The terrain favored neither a clean encirclement nor a rapid armored sweep once the fight entered the built-up area. Stalingrad's length along the river meant that Soviet troops could continue receiving reinforcements from the east bank as long as crossing points remained functional. The river was an obstacle, but it was also a supply line for the defenders. The German army had extensive experience in combined arms operations. Artillery, aircraft, engineers, armor, and infantry could work together to break strong positions. In open country, tanks could exploit gaps and move around resistance. In a city of rubble and industrial buildings, those advantages became harder to combine. A tank moving down a street could be engaged from a cellar, a side street, or a damaged building. Artillery could destroy a structure without guaranteeing that defenders inside were eliminated. Bombing could create rubble that blocked vehicles and provided new cover. Infantry had to clear positions room by room, staircase by staircase, and courtyard by courtyard. This did not mean cities were impossible to capture. German forces had taken many urban areas earlier in the war. The problem at Stalingrad was the relationship between the city and the larger front. Sixth Army would spend more and more of its experienced infantry trying to take the last defensive zones, while long sectors outside the city depended on Allied armies and limited reserves. The Soviet command understood the value of time. Holding even a narrow strip along the Volga forced German troops to remain committed. Every week spent fighting in Stalingrad was a week in which Soviet reserves could gather elsewhere. Every German division drawn into the city was one less formation available behind the flanks. By August, the city had also become a target for the Luftwaffe. German air power remained formidable on the southern front. Aircraft could attack railways, ferries, troop concentrations, and urban targets. Heavy bombing would soon devastate much of Stalingrad. But destruction created its own paradox. A city reduced to ruins could become more difficult to move through. Streets filled with debris. Landmarks disappeared. Cellars survived beneath collapsed buildings. Rubble created firing positions and blocked clear observation. The German plans still expected offensive power to solve the problem. Sixth Army would cross the Don and drive toward the Volga. Fourth Panzer Army would pressure the city from the south. Soviet forces would be compressed against the river and destroyed. The plan had logic. What it did not have was unlimited time. The fighting season was advancing. German formations were operating far from their bases. Army Group O was deep in the Caucasus. The front from the Baltic to the Black Sea demanded divisions everywhere. The Soviet Union continued forming armies despite enormous losses. For the German command, the city seemed to offer a decisive conclusion to the summer campaign. For the Soviet command, It offered a place where German strength could be fixed in one narrow area. Those two ideas were about to meet on the banks of the Volga. The city's geography also created a problem of scale for both attacker and defender. Stalingrad ran along the Volga for many kilometers. A breakthrough in the south did not automatically collapse the north. A penetration near the center could divide Soviet units without preventing reinforcements from crossing farther away. The Germans therefore had to fight several connected battles rather than one assault against one center. Railways and ravines complicated movement from west to east. A unit advancing toward the river might have to cross an embankment, clear a housing district, descend into a gully, and then attack another line of buildings. Each feature gave the defender another place to slow the attack. The Volga also gave the Soviet command interior movement of a different kind. Forces on the east bank could be directed toward whichever crossing point remained usable. Barges, ferries, and small boats did not create a comfortable supply system, but they prevented the defenders from being entirely dependent on roads inside the city. German planners understood that the river had to be interdicted. Artillery and aircraft attacked crossings repeatedly. The problem was complete denial. Night, distance, multiple landing points, and the width of the river made it difficult to stop every movement. A few boats arriving were enough to deliver ammunition or a company of infantry to a sector that might otherwise collapse. The city therefore offered the Soviet command a way to trade space for time without losing the ability to reinforce entirely. For the German command, it offered the opposite temptation, the belief that because the defenders had so little space left, they must be close to defeat. This visual impression would influence decisions for months. German soldiers could literally see the river behind Soviet positions. The remaining distance looked small. Yet operationally, that small distance was supported by the entire Soviet system beyond the East Bank. Before 6th Army could reach Stalingrad, it had to cross the Don. The river curved broadly west of the city, creating a large bend in which Soviet forces attempted to slow the German advance. The fighting around Kalak and the approaches to the river in late July and early August became an important stage in the campaign. The German army had crossed major rivers many times. Engineers could build bridges, repair damaged crossings, and support armored movement. But a crossing under opposition was never only an engineering problem. Artillery had to suppress the far bank. Infantry had to seize bridgeheads. Anti-tank guns and tanks had to cross before Soviet counterattacks could push the first troops back into the river. The Soviet command committed forces west of the Don in an effort to block the approach to Stalingrad. The fighting was confused and costly. German units continued to gain ground, but the advance no longer resembled uncontested pursuit. Around Kalak, German armored formations were able to trap and defeat significant Soviet forces during August. The success opened the way toward crossings and confirmed the belief that 6th Army still possessed enough offensive strength to finish the campaign. Yet the victory did not destroy the Soviet ability to defend Stalingrad. Units east of the Don continued preparing positions. Reinforcements moved toward the city. The Soviet 62nd Army would become the main defender inside Stalingrad, while other armies fought on the approaches and flanks. For German soldiers moving into the Don bridgeheads, the landscape began to narrow operationally. Behind them lay long supply routes. Ahead of them was the corridor between the Don and Volga. To the north and south, the security of the advance depended on neighboring formations holding broad sectors. The Don crossing also represented a psychological threshold. Once major forces were east of the river, Stalingrad seemed close. On a map, the distance from the Don bend to the Volga was far smaller than the hundreds of kilometers already covered since the beginning of the summer offensive. This appearance encouraged the idea that the hardest movement was complete. In reality, the most difficult fighting had not yet begun. The Soviet command launched counterattacks against the German bridgeheads and flanks. Some achieved only limited results, but they forced German formations to remain alert and consumed ammunition, fuel, and time. The Germans could not simply drive east with every available unit. They had to protect the crossings that sustained the drive. Traffic across the river became constant. Tanks, guns, trucks, field kitchens, ambulances, and staff vehicles moved toward the eastern bank. Damaged vehicles and wounded soldiers moved the other way. Engineers maintained bridges against wear, congestion, and air attack. The same roads also carried uncertainty. Reports from the front changed rapidly. A Soviet unit might be identified in one village and gone the next day. German reconnaissance found defenses, but not always the depth behind them. Sixth Army's leadership expected the next movement to force the Soviet defenders back into the city and against the Volga. The German command intended to create pressure from more than one direction, with 4th Panzer Army approaching from the south. The timing, however, had already become complicated by earlier changes in German operational plans. Units had been shifted between directions during the summer. Fuel and road capacity had been spent moving formations whose missions changed. What looked like flexibility at the level of high command created friction at the level of transport and maintenance. By the middle of August, the German advance regained momentum. Bridgeheads expanded. The road towards Stalingrad opened. The XUV Panzer Corps prepared to strike east from the Don toward the Volga north of the city. Its armored formations would attempt a rapid penetration across the steppe, bypassing some resistance and reaching the river before the Soviet command could form a continuous defense. This was the kind of operation in which German mobile forces were most dangerous. Open ground allowed speed. Air support could attack Soviet concentrations. A breakthrough could turn local success into operational shock. On the Soviet side, the danger was clear. If German armor reached the Volga north of Stalingrad, the city would be partly cut from land communications on its western side. Reinforcements would depend even more heavily on the river and routes from the east. The coming attack, therefore, carried more significance than the distance on the map suggested. The Don was behind 6th Army. The Volga was ahead. Between them lay the lost open ground before the battle became a struggle for streets, factories, and ruins. The operations around the Don also exposed a difference between capturing terrain and maintaining tempo. German mobile units could seize a bridgehead rapidly, but the infantry, artillery, workshops, and supply columns behind them moved at different speeds. When the front advanced faster than those supporting elements, the spearhead could become powerful and fragile at the same time. 4th Panzer Army's movements during the summer illustrated the problem. Its formations had been redirected as German High Command tried to balance the Caucasus Drive with the attack on Stalingrad. The tanks themselves could cover distance quickly when fuel was available, but the supporting system could not shift direction without delay. Workshops, fuel columns, bridging units, and headquarters had to follow. The Soviet command used these pauses to rebuild defensive lines. Even unsuccessful counterattacks forced the Germans to deploy and consume ammunition. A Soviet attack that lost tanks could still buy hours, during which another defensive position was prepared farther east. The Don also created an obstacle to German flexibility after the crossing. Once major formations and their supplies moved east of the river, returning them west in an emergency would depend on the same limited bridges. This would matter enormously in November. The crossings that enabled the advance towards Stalingrad would later sit behind an army trying to escape encirclement. German staffs did not ignore this possibility completely, but the campaign was still being planned around continued advance. Logistics flowed toward the front, not backward from a future pocket. Supply depots were established where they best supported the city battle. Artillery ammunition accumulated in areas that later became trapped inside the encirclement. Military systems are built around expectations. When the expected direction of movement changes suddenly, the system can become an obstacle. In August, no one in 6th Army intended to retreat from Stalingrad. The entire arrangement east of the Don assumed the next important movement would be forward. On the 23rd of August, 1942, German armored forces broke eastward toward the Volga north of Stalingrad. Elements of XTVV Panzer Corps moved rapidly across the steppe. The objective was the river itself. By the end of the day, German troops had reached the Volga near the northern outskirts of the city. For the soldiers at the front of the advance, the sight of the river suggested success. The Volga had been one of the great geographic objectives of the summer. Reaching it meant that German forces had crossed the enormous distance from the Don and had cut into the Soviet position at Stalingrad from the north. But reaching the Volga at one point was not the same as taking the city. The German spearhead formed a narrow corridor. Soviet forces remained to the north and south. The armored units at the river depended on the road behind them. Counterattacks threatened the shoulders of the penetration. What looked on a map like a line from the Don to the Volga was in reality a route that had to be defended along its entire length. The same day brought one of the most destructive air attacks of the campaign. Luftwaffe aircraft struck Stalingrad heavily. Fires spread through urban districts. Buildings collapsed, streets filled with debris, and civilians were killed in large numbers. The bombing damaged Soviet communications and created enormous destruction, but it did not remove the defenders from the city. In many places it transformed the terrain into exactly the kind of broken environment in which infantry could hide, move through ruins, and fight at close range. For German commanders, the air attack seemed to prepare the ground for the assault. For civilians and soldiers inside Stalingrad, it marked the beginning of a new phase in which the city itself became the battlefield. The Soviet command continued moving troops toward the area. The Volga remained open behind the defenders. Ferries and boats could bring men, ammunition, and food from the east bank and carry wounded personnel back. German artillery and aircraft threatened the crossings, especially during daylight, but could not stop them completely. North of the city, German troops at the Volga faced repeated Soviet attacks. The narrow corridor toward the river had to be protected. This tied down formations that might otherwise have been used inside Stalingrad. To the south, 4th Panzer Army fought toward the city from another direction. The intended convergence developed slowly. Soviet resistance and the terrain prevented one clean closing movement. By the end of August, 6th Army had reached the outer defenses of Stalingrad. The city stretched along the river from southern districts, and the grain elevator through the center toward the great factory zone in the north. German reconnaissance and maps could identify major landmarks, but once fighting began, those landmarks would become separate battlefields. The grain elevator would dominate part of the southern city. Railway stations would change hands. Mamayev Kurgan, a prominent height near the center, would be fought over repeatedly. Farther north, the tractor factory, barricade complex, and Red October works would become names associated with weeks of close combat. The German High Command still expected a decision. The Soviet defenders had been pushed against a major river. German aircraft dominated much of the sky. Artillery and armor surrounded the city from the west. To an attacker looking at the map, the Soviet position appeared dangerously narrow. But narrow did not mean weak. A defender pressed against the Volga had little room to retreat, but as long as the crossings worked, the river was not simply an obstacle behind the army. It was a supply route. Soviet units could arrive at night, cross under fire, and move directly into positions only a short distance from the bank. For the Germans, every meter toward the river reduced the space available to the defenders. At the same time, every meter taken inside the city required infantry to occupy and protect more ruins. The difference between operational success and tactical possession began to blur. A German battalion could capture a block and still be fired upon from the next building. A factory workshop could be taken while defenders remained in adjacent structures. A hill could be occupied during daylight and contested again at night. The city would not fall because German tanks had seen the Volga. It would have to be fought through. At the end of August, 6th Army stood before Stalingrad, with the summer campaign still apparently within reach. The Don crossings were secure enough to sustain the attack. The Luftwaffe was active. German formations held a corridor to the Volga north of the city. Yet the army had already begun exchanging mobility for possession. The next phase would draw it away from the open steppe and into terrain where the advantages of maneuver would shrink. The river had been reached. The battle for the city was only beginning. In September, the battle moved from the approaches into Stalingrad itself. The city had already been damaged by bombing and artillery. Streets were broken by craters and debris. Buildings stood without roofs or interior walls. Rail lines crossed districts that had become defensive zones. Cellars, embankments, workshops, apartment blocks, and ravines divided the battlefield into pieces that were difficult to understand from a headquarters map. On the 12th of September, General Vasily Chuikov took command of the Soviet 62nd Army, the formation that would become most closely associated with the defense of the city. The following day, German attacks opened a major attempt to drive the defenders from central Stalingrad and reach the Volga crossings. For 6th Army, the task looked straightforward in operational terms. Push east. Split the Soviet defense. Capture the high ground and the central districts. Reach the river and deny the defenders their crossing points. On the ground, each part of that instruction became a separate battle. German artillery and aircraft struck suspected positions before infantry advanced. Tanks supported the assault where streets and rubble allowed. Engineers cleared mines, demolished strongpoints, and used specialized weapons against defended buildings. Infantry moved behind the bombardment, searching cellars and upper floors. The Soviet defenders deliberately reduced the distance between the two sides. Close contact made German air and artillery support more difficult to use without danger to German troops. Positions were held in buildings, factories, trenches, and shell holes. Small groups crossed streets or courtyards rather than moving in large formations. The result was a battlefield measured in very short distances. A German company might be ordered to take a railway station, a group of houses, or one side of a square. Success did not necessarily reveal what lay beyond. A street corner could hide a machine gun. A wall could separate friendly and enemy troops. A cellar might remain occupied after the floors above it had been cleared. Communication became difficult. Field telephone wires were cut by shelling. Radios worked unevenly among heavy structures and rubble. Runners had to cross exposed ground. Commanders often knew the location of their own forward companies only approximately. Tanks faced unusual problems. In open terrain, armor could maneuver around resistance and exploit a breakthrough. In Stalingrad, streets channeled movement. Rubble blocked routes. Anti-tank weapons could fire from concealed positions. Infantry protection became essential, yet infantry itself was being consumed by the close fighting. The Germans still made progress. They fought toward the central railway stations and Mamayev Kurgan. Some positions changed hands repeatedly. German units reached sections of the Volga bank in several places, threatening to divide the Soviet defenders into isolated bridgeheads. But no single penetration ended the battle. The Soviet army continued crossing the Volga, often at night. Boats moved through artillery fire and air attack. Reinforcements arrived and were sent directly into sectors where German attacks had nearly broken through. Supplies crossed in the same way. Wounded soldiers moved east when space and transport allowed. From the German side, this created a frustrating pattern. A defensive position seemed close to collapse. A final attack was planned. Then fresh Soviet troops appeared, sometimes only enough to restore a few buildings or a narrow strip near the river. The fighting also consumed leadership. Platoon leaders, company commanders, experienced non-commissioned officers, machine gun crews, and engineers were difficult to replace. A division could remain on the map with the same name, while the quality of its infantry companies changed week by week. This mattered because urban combat rewarded experience. Men learned which walls offered cover, how to move between buildings, how to coordinate with tanks, when to call artillery, and how to recognize the sound of enemy movement nearby. When experienced soldiers were lost, replacements had to learn those lessons under fire. German doctrine emphasized combined arms, but the city constantly pulled those arms apart. Artillery could prepare an attack, yet the final clearing still belonged to infantry. Aircraft could destroy a block, but they could not occupy it. Tanks could fire into a strong point, but they could not safely remain without infantry around them. The Soviet defense faced the same brutal logic. Units crossing the Volga were often committed quickly. Positions could disappear under bombardment. Communications failed. The river crossings were dangerous. The defenders suffered enormous casualties. The difference was that the Soviet command accepted the city as a place to absorb German strength while reserves gathered beyond the immediate battlefield. For Sixth Army, the city was the objective itself. That difference grew more important as September continued. The German army was still advancing by local measures. More streets were occupied. More Soviet positions were forced toward the river. Yet the operational result did not match the tactical effort. The Volga remained in Soviet use. The 62nd Army remained in Stalingrad. And every day spent in the ruins gave the wider Soviet command more time. The battle had become a contest in which taking ground was necessary but not sufficient. Sixth Army could win a block and still lose time. It could reach the river and still fail to destroy the enemy. It could reduce a building to rubble and discover that the rubble had become another defensive position. By mid-September, Stalingrad was no longer simply a point on the German summer offensive. It was beginning to shape the army attacking it. The structure of the city also changed the meaning of firepower. In open country, an artillery concentration could suppress a position and create space for maneuver. In Stalingrad, a bombardment might remove the upper floors of a building while leaving a cellar intact. A wall that collapsed into a street could block the very tanks the bombardment was intended to support. German infantry therefore learned to use smaller assault detachments. One group might suppress windows while another moved through a courtyard. Engineers opened passages through walls to avoid exposed streets. Machine guns covered doorways. Tanks sometimes fired directly into buildings from very short range. These methods required coordination that became harder as units weakened. A fresh battalion could organize carefully rehearsed teams. A battalion reduced by weeks of combat might combine survivors from several companies and attach replacements who had never trained with the engineers supporting them. The battle also placed unusual demands on ammunition. Close combat consumed grenades, mortar rounds, demolition charges, and machine gun ammunition quickly. Heavy artillery fired repeated preparations against objectives that might be only a few hundred meters from German positions. Bringing those supplies forward required trucks to reach distribution points near a battlefield where routes were under observation and shell fire. The city at night was not simply the daytime battle without sunlight. Darkness allowed Soviet boats to cross the Volga with less exposure to German aircraft. Small groups could move through rubble unseen. German units used flares and listening posts, but a position secure in daylight could be approached closely after dark. Sleep itself became a military resource. Units that fought during the day had to maintain guards at night. Artillery interruptions and local attacks prevented regular rest. The physical exhaustion of urban combat therefore accumulated even when a unit was not actively assaulting. Senior headquarters saw this through strength reports. Battalion might have only a fraction of its original rifle strength. A company might be led by an officer junior to the rank normally expected. Yet the front line still required the same number of buildings to be held. The narrower Soviet bridgehead became, the more German units were packed into the same battle. Instead of releasing strength, progress concentrated effort. This was one reason the city could appear almost captured for weeks without actually falling. The lost Soviet positions were not necessarily the strongest because they were large. They were strong because the remaining battlefield was compressed against a supply line the Germans could not completely cut. In the southern part of Stalingrad stood a structure that could be seen from a great distance, the grain elevator. Its concrete towers rose above the lower buildings around them. Before the war, the structure had served an ordinary industrial purpose. During the battle, height, thickness, and location transformed it into key terrain. The fighting around the grain elevator in September became one example of what the entire battle was becoming. German forces advancing through southern Stalingrad needed to clear the area and secure routes toward the Volga. The elevator overlooked nearby ground and could be used as an observation point and strong defensive position. Soviet troops inside and around the structure resisted repeated attacks. For the attackers, the building created a familiar urban problem in an unusually concentrated form. Artillery and direct fire could damage it, but thick concrete survived. Smoke, dust, and burning grain reduced visibility. Assaulting troops had to move close enough to enter a position from which defenders could fire from multiple levels. The struggle lasted for days rather than hours. It is tempting to tell such a battle as a story of one heroic building against an entire army. The reality was less tidy. The grain elevator was one strong point within a much larger fight involving German and Soviet formations across southern Stalingrad. Units arrived, attacked, withdrew, reinforced one another, and shifted around nearby positions. Its importance came from how a single structure could delay movement far beyond its physical size. A building that had to be cleared could hold up a road. A road that remained blocked could delay tanks and artillery. A delay in one sector could prevent neighboring attacks from being coordinated. In urban combat, terrain did not have to be large to have operational effect. German assault groups used infantry, engineers, machine guns, mortars, and direct fire weapons. Tanks could support from positions where rubble allowed. The objective was not merely to damage the structure, but to remove the defenders from it. Inside, conditions were difficult for both sides. Dust and smoke filled enclosed spaces. Water and ammunition became critical. Communication with units outside could be uncertain. The physical building shaped every decision about movement and observation. Eventually, German troops took the grain elevator. By then, the local fighting had consumed time and men that could not easily be recovered. The pattern repeated elsewhere. A station, a warehouse, a workers' settlement, a factory shop, a hill, a group of apartment blocks. Each objective looks small when compared with the size of the Eastern Front. Together, they absorbed the infantry strength of 6th Army. The battle also distorted the meaning of progress. If a strong point fell after several days, the map could be updated and the attack described as successful. But if the defenders had forced the attacker to spend more time and casualties than planned, the operational exchange might still favor the defense. The German army needed more than possession of southern Stalingrad. It needed the Soviet defense to collapse before the wider campaign reached its limit. That collapse did not happen. Instead, the 62nd Army continued holding sectors along the Volga. New defensive lines formed behind lost positions. Soviet artillery on the east bank could support troops inside the city. Reinforcements continued crossing the river. The German command, therefore, moved effort northward and toward central sectors. The next objectives included Mamayev Kurgan and the industrial districts. The grain elevator had been captured. Stalingrad had not. For the German soldiers leaving the southern fight, the lesson was clear, even if its larger meaning was not. A building could take days. A district could take weeks. And the city extended for kilometers along the river. By the second half of September, the German attack had reached deep into Stalingrad. From a distance, the Soviet position appeared precarious. In some places, the defenders held only a narrow strip between German positions and the Volga. German troops had reached the river in separate sectors, splitting the battlefield and threatening crossing points. Yet the Soviet defense continued. The battle around Mamayev Kurgan showed why. The height stood near the center of the city and offered observation across surrounding districts and toward the river. Control of the hill mattered to artillery observers and infantry alike. It changed hands repeatedly, and even when one side occupied much of it, shelling and counterattacks prevented secure possession. The ground itself was transformed. Trenches crossed slopes already broken by bombardment. Craters overlapped. Trees were shattered. Units could hold one face of the height, while enemy troops remained close on the other. Near the central railway stations, fighting followed a similar rhythm. Buildings and platforms were taken, lost, and retaken. A headquarters report might announce possession of a station in the morning and record renewed fighting there by evening. This instability made maps deceptive. A colored line could show German control across most of a district, but the line could not show every cellar, stairwell, ravine, or ruined workshop. Nor could it show how exhausted the companies holding that line had become. German infantry divisions were losing experienced men at a rate difficult to replace. New soldiers could fill the numbers, but numbers did not restore experience. A replacement arriving in Stalingrad entered a battlefield where the front could be on the next floor of the same building. The demands on junior leaders were especially severe. Small units often fought with limited contact to higher headquarters. A lieutenant or sergeant might have to decide whether to attack a doorway, hold a cellar, request artillery, or withdraw from a position without knowing the full situation beyond the next block. The German command responded by using assault groups tailored for urban fighting. Engineers became increasingly important. Heavy weapons were moved close to strong points. Artillery concentrations attempted to isolate objectives before infantry entered. These methods could succeed tactically. The problem was scale. Every assault group contained specialists. Every specialist lost had to be replaced. Every gun move into the ruins required ammunition. Every tank damaged in a street had to be recovered under fire or abandoned. The Soviet defense also depended on small groups. Chekhov's army tried to keep German troops so close that German firepower could not be used freely. Strong points were connected by short movements through rubble and trenches. The Volga crossings remained the lifeline. At night, boats brought men and ammunition across the river. The crossings were dangerous and sometimes chaotic. German artillery and aircraft struck landing areas. Yet enough supplies continued to arrive to keep the defense alive. From German positions overlooking the river, the movement could be seen or heard, but not completely stopped. This created another paradox. The closer Sixth Army pushed the defenders toward the Volga, the closer it moved to the very crossing points sustaining them. But the final distance was often the hardest. The riverbank contained steep ground, gullies, landing sites, industrial structures, and defensive positions that could be supported from the east bank. German artillery could shell the opposite bank, but it could not erase the entire Soviet logistical system. The Volga was broad, and the Soviet command could shift crossing points and operate at night. The struggle became increasingly physical and local. A platoon knew the next house. A battalion knew the next block. A division knew the next district. The army knew that the river lay only a short distance ahead. That difference in scale mattered. Sixth Army's mission remained operational: destroy the Soviet defense and take Stalingrad. Its units were increasingly fighting tactical battles that consumed strength without producing that operational result. October approached. The weather began to change. Nights grew colder. Dust gave way to rain and mud in some areas. The German command prepared a new series of attacks toward the factory district in the north. The city still seemed close to falling. But the closer the Germans came to the river, the less room remained for maneuver, and the more the battle depended on infantry strength. That was exactly the resource being worn away. North Stalingrad was dominated by great industrial complexes whose names became part of the battle: the tractor factory, Barricade, and Red October. These were not single buildings. They were broad areas of workshops, foundries, warehouses, rail spurs, offices, workers' housing, storage yards, and heavy machinery. bombing had damaged roofs and walls, but large structures remained. Underground spaces, pits, and broken equipment provided cover. In October, 6th Army concentrated major effort against this district. The objective was to break the remaining Soviet bridgeheads and reach the Volga across the northern city. German commanders assembled artillery, tanks, infantry, and engineers for attacks intended to finish the battle. The assault on the tractor factory area in mid-October made significant gains. German troops drove through positions and reached the Volga in another sector, splitting Soviet forces. Yet the fighting did not end. Barricade and Red October became separate battles within the larger one. At the Red October works, the Martinovsky shop and surrounding industrial buildings showed how factory terrain could consume attackers. Massive halls created long interior lines of sight broken by machinery and rubble. Walls divided one part of a complex from another. Tanks could fire into openings, but could not easily maneuver inside every section. At Barricade, fighting around workshops and administrative buildings followed the same pattern. A structure might be described as captured when most of it had been taken, while defenders remained in a corner, cellar, or adjacent trench system. The Germans employed assault pioneers and specialized detachments. Heavy guns were brought forward for direct fire. Stuka dive bombers and other Luftwaffe aircraft continued attacking Soviet positions when weather permitted. The Soviet defenders answered with close-range resistance and repeated reinforcement. Artillery from the east bank fired across the Volga. Small groups crossed at night and moved directly into the factory sectors. The result was a battle in which tactical success came at steadily increasing cost. German infantry strength declined. Divisions that had begun the summer with confidence in their mobility now fought as collections of worn battalions inside a city. Experienced soldiers who had survived the advance across the steppe were lost in factories whose names few had known months earlier. The problem was not only casualties. Urban combat damaged equipment faster than normal planning expected. Tanks lost tracks on rubble or were hit at close range. Trucks could not move freely in forward areas. Artillery ammunition had to be brought through congested routes. Engineers exhausted specialized charges and tools. Commanders tried to rotate units where possible, but the demand for troops remained constant. There was always another position to clear and another counterattack to stop. The Soviet army was suffering equally severe or greater losses in many local actions, but it possessed a strategic advantage the Germans could not see from inside the city. The wider Soviet command was preparing forces beyond Stalingrad, while 6th Army concentrated on factories along the Volga. Soviet armies gathered north and south of the city. The German flanks were held by Axis allies across long stretches of open country. Romanian formations in particular occupied sectors north and south of the Stalingrad concentration. These troops had fought hard in earlier operations, but many lacked enough modern anti-tank guns to meet a large Soviet armored attack. Their fronts were broad, and German reserves behind them were limited. Every additional German unit committed to the factory district was a unit not available for those flanks. This was the operational exchange hidden inside the urban battle. A German assault could take another factory hall and make the city map look closer to completion. At the same time, the army's ability to respond to danger outside the city could become weaker. The German command knew the flanks were not ideal. Reports described Soviet activity. Reinforcement was considered. Yet Stalingrad still appeared almost won, and the pressure to finish the city remained stronger than the impulse to stop and rebuild the wider position. By late October, German troops held most of Stalingrad by area. The Soviet defenders had been compressed into narrow sectors near the Volga. The difference between most and all now became decisive. If the remaining bridgeheads could be eliminated quickly, Sixth Army might finally be released. If they could not, the army would remain fixed in the ruins while winter approached. The factories had turned the battle into a contest of endurance. The next great decision would not be made in a workshop or on a street. It would be made far beyond the city, on the exposed flanks of the entire German position. The factory complexes also created a battle between different kinds of military time. An operational commander thought in days. When could the city be cleared? When could a division be released? When could reserves be moved to the flank? A company commander inside Red October thought in minutes. When would the next artillery preparation end? When could the next room be entered? When would ammunition arrive? The two scales did not align. A local attack could be entirely rational and still contribute to an operational mistake. If one workshop dominated the next approach, it had to be cleared before the battalion could move. If every workshop required the same effort, the army could spend weeks doing necessary things that no longer served the larger situation. German commanders tried to solve this by concentrating force. Heavy artillery and air attacks struck selected sectors. Assault engineers were grouped for important objectives. Tanks supported infantry at close range. The expectation was that enough concentrated violence would finally rupture the remaining Soviet bridgehead. But the Soviet defense no longer needed an uninterrupted front in the traditional sense. Small positions could survive in fragments. A group cut off in one factory building could still delay movement until ammunition ran out. Defenders on the riverbank could receive support from artillery across the Volga, even when roads inside the city were lost. The industrial district therefore punished the attacker for every assumption that had worked on the steppe. Speed was replaced by clearing. Bypass was replaced by occupation. Long-range observation was replaced by uncertainty behind walls. Armored mobility was replaced by short movements between debris. At the army level, the greatest cost was not any single factory. It was the disappearance of reserve strength. A reserve exists so that a commander can react to the unexpected. In Stalingrad, the unexpected happened every day inside the city, so reserves were repeatedly committed to local problems. A Soviet counterattack threatened one district. A German regiment needed help to finish an assault. An exhausted division required reinforcement. Each decision made sense in isolation. Together, they left less available for a crisis outside the city. By November, that crisis was no longer hypothetical. By the end of October, German maps showed a city largely in German hands. From the southern districts through the center and into much of the factory area, Sixth Army had taken enormous stretches of Stalingrad. Soviet positions remained in narrow bridgeheads along the Volga, especially around parts of the industrial district and riverbank. The map suggested that the battle was nearly finished. The condition of the army suggested something else. Infantry battalions were tired and reduced. Replacements had arrived, but many lacked the experience of the men they replaced. Tanks and assault guns required maintenance. Artillery ammunition had been consumed at a high rate. Engineers had spent weeks clearing strong points and supporting attacks. The weather was worsening. Cold nights became more common. Rain and mud affected roads behind the front. The steppe that had baked under summer heat was moving toward winter. Inside the city, the Soviet defenders continued holding positions that seemed impossibly small when viewed from the German side. Their survival prevented Sixth Army from declaring the objective complete. This mattered psychologically as well as operationally. After months of advance and weeks of fighting, giving up the attack, when the river appeared only hundreds of meters away, in some places was difficult to imagine. Every previous loss made the final effort seem more necessary. If the army stopped now, what had the earlier casualties achieved? This is one of the traps of prolonged battle. Past cost cannot be recovered by spending more, yet past cost can make stopping feel unacceptable. German high command pressure reinforced that tendency. Hitler expected Stalingrad to be taken. Reports of progress encouraged the belief that one more attack could finish the task. But the Soviet army did not need to control most of the city to achieve its larger purpose. It needed to remain in enough of Stalingrad to keep Sixth Army committed. The difference between territory and enemy destruction had become critical. A German headquarters could calculate that a high percentage of the city was occupied. That percentage did not answer the most important question: was the Soviet defense broken? It was not. Across the Volga, artillery and supply systems continued operating. New troops still crossed. Soviet commanders could accept the loss of another building if the remaining bridgehead survived. Meanwhile, the front outside Stalingrad stretched far beyond the city. To the northwest and southwest, Romanian armies held long sectors. Farther west and north, other Axis Allied formations covered additional frontages. German units were dispersed across an immense theater from the Caucasus to the Upper Don. The German army had created a great salient toward Stalingrad, while Army Group A remained deep in the Caucasus. The shape of the front was dangerous. Sixth Army stood at the eastern tip. Its supply lines ran back across the Don. Its flanks depended on formations with fewer anti-tank weapons and less mobile reserve strength than the German divisions inside the city. The Soviet command had been studying exactly those weaknesses. German intelligence detected concentrations and reported Soviet forces gathering. Yet the scale and purpose remained uncertain. Some commanders expected attacks. Few anticipated a counteroffensive large enough to surround the entire Sixth Army. The reason was understandable. Encircling an army required Soviet forces to break through both flanks, drive deep into the rear, cross rivers, seize road hubs, and link their spearheads before the Germans could respond. It was a large operation, but the Red Army of late 1942 was not the Red Army German commanders remembered from the summer of 1941. It had learned, rebuilt, and accumulated reserves. Soviet commanders were increasingly capable of planning operations across several fronts. In the city, none of this changed the immediate routine. German companies prepared attacks. Soviet companies prepared defenses. Artillery fired, boats crossed the Volga at night, engineers searched for routes through ruins. The battle continued to look east toward the river. The danger was gathering in the west. By early November, winter was close. Sixth Army still believed it could finish Stalingrad. Within weeks, finishing the city would no longer be the question. The question would be whether the army itself could escape. The German command also had to interpret what the Soviet bridgeheads meant. One possibility was that they were simply the remnants of an army close to destruction. Another was that they were deliberately maintained anchors fixing Sixth Army in place. The first interpretation encouraged one more assault. The second suggested the need to look beyond the city. German intelligence did not possess perfect information about Soviet intentions. Reconnaissance identified units and movements, but Soviet operational deception reduced the clarity of the buildup. The Germans also had to judge the reports against their experience of earlier Soviet attacks, many of which had been costly and poorly coordinated. This created a dangerous form of confidence. The Red Army was respected tactically in many local sectors, yet still underestimated operationally. German officers could believe simultaneously that the Soviet soldier in the next building was difficult to defeat, and that the Soviet High Command was unlikely to execute a large encirclement successfully. The two judgments were about to collide. There was also no single moment when the decision to continue attacking Stalingrad became obviously irrational to everyone involved. Each day had its own reasons. A factory sector appeared close to collapse. A new assault had already been prepared. Artillery ammunition had been moved forward. A pause might give the Soviet defenders time to reinforce. This is how operational commitment can deepen without one dramatic decision. The army continued because stopping seemed costly, and every day of continuing made stopping more necessary. By November, the attack had become part of the German position itself. Sixth Army was not merely ordered to capture Stalingrad. Its entire deployment, supply system, and command attention had been organized around doing so. Changing that orientation required more than issuing a new objective. It required time that the Soviet counteroffensive would not provide. The flanks of Sixth Army did not look dramatic from inside Stalingrad. There were no famous factories there, no shattered railway stations, and no narrow strips of riverbank fought over building by building. Instead, the front curved across open steppe, villages, river lines, and long stretches of ground that seemed quieter than the city. That quiet was dangerous. Northwest of Stalingrad, the Romanian Third Army held a broad sector along the Don. South of the city, the Romanian Fourth Army covered another long frontage. Romanian troops had fought alongside German forces since the beginning of the campaign in the east, and many units had suffered heavily. Their soldiers were not simply unwilling defenders waiting to collapse. The problem was that the sectors they were asked to hold were too large for their strength, and their anti-tank equipment was inadequate against a major concentration of Soviet armor. German commanders were aware of these weaknesses. Requests for stronger anti-tank weapons and reserves were not new. German units were placed behind some threatened areas, but the reserves were too limited to cover every possible breakthrough. The strongest German formations in the region were still tied to the city or committed elsewhere. This was the price of the campaign's geography. Army Group A remained deep in the Caucasus. 6th Army faced east into Stalingrad. 4th Panzer Army was positioned south of the city. Axis Allied armies extended along the Don and across the open country between German concentrations. The front could be held as long as the Soviet army attacked locally. The Soviet plan was not local. During the autumn, the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, prepared a counteroffensive designed to avoid the strongest German positions inside Stalingrad. Instead of attacking directly into 6th Army, Soviet forces would strike the weaker Axis flanks north and south of the city. The operation received the name Uranus. Its logic was simple and ambitious. Break through Romanian armies. Send armored and mechanized formations rapidly into the German rear. Meet west of Stalingrad. Trap 6th Army and other forces between the Soviet spearheads and the Volga. For the plan to work, surprise and concentration mattered. Soviet armies assembled artillery, tanks, cavalry, infantry, fuel, and ammunition behind the front. Movements were concealed where possible. New units arrived. Bridges and crossing sites were prepared. German intelligence observed some of this activity. Prisoners and reconnaissance reported Soviet concentrations. Officers on the flanks warned about the vulnerability of their positions. Some German commanders expected an attack against the Romanian Third Army. What remained uncertain was the scale. The German command had spent months watching Soviet attacks fail or achieve limited results. It was easy to imagine that another offensive would be dangerous, but containable. German mobile reserves could move to the threatened sector. Luftwaffe aircraft could attack Soviet columns. The Romanian line might bend without breaking completely. That expectation depended on having enough reserves and enough time. Neither existed in abundance. The German 48th Panzer Corps stood behind part of the northern flank, but its effective armored strength was limited, and its units were not positioned to defeat an offensive of the size approaching. Other German divisions were scattered or still fighting in Stalingrad. The weather also reduced the certainty of air support. Winter clouds snowed. Snow and poor flying conditions could ground aircraft at the moment they were most needed. On the Romanian front, soldiers prepared defensive positions with the weapons available to them. Some sectors had strong points around villages or along ridges. Between them were wide gaps. Anti-tank guns capable of defeating newer Soviet tanks were too few. A defensive line can appear continuous on a map because colored symbols connect one headquarters to another. On the ground, continuity depends on fields of fire, reserves, communications, obstacles, and the ability to move strength toward a breakthrough. The Soviet plan aimed to break all of those connections at once. Inside Stalingrad, 6th Army continued attacking. In early November, German troops made another effort against the remaining Soviet positions in the factory district. Local gains were achieved, but the defenders were not eliminated. Once again, the army spent infantry and ammunition without gaining release from the city. The timing could hardly have been worse. Every battalion committed eastward was a battalion unavailable to move west. Every tank used among the factories was a tank not waiting behind the Romanian fronts. Every day spent trying to reach the last sections of the Volga allowed the Soviet buildup to continue. The German High Command did not ignore the possibility of danger. But it did not change the basic commitment to Stalingrad either. The army remained oriented toward the city. The supply system remained organized to feed that battle. The headquarters looked east, because the enemy directly in front of them remained visible and close. The enemy preparing to surround them was farther away and hidden behind another army's front. By the middle of November, snow had begun to appear across the steppe. Temperatures fell. Vehicles became harder to start. Roads froze, which in some ways improved movement after the mud, but the cold created new demands for clothing, shelter, and maintenance. The soldiers in Stalingrad knew winter had arrived. They did not yet know that the entire shape of the campaign was about to change. The Soviet artillery north of the city had been quiet enough to preserve surprise. Before dawn on the 19th of November, that quiet ended. The vulnerability of the flanks was also a problem of depth. A strong front is not only the trench or village occupied by the first soldiers. It is the system behind them, anti-tank positions, reserve battalions, artillery that can shift fire, engineers able to block roads, and mobile formations prepared to counter-attack a penetration before it becomes a breakthrough. Across much of the Romanian front, that depth was insufficient. The frontage was too wide, and the weapons needed to defeat modern Soviet tanks were unevenly distributed. German anti-tank detachments could strengthen selected points, but strengthening one point left another exposed. The Soviet build-up exploited this geometry. Artillery and infantry were concentrated against chosen sectors rather than spread evenly. Armored formations waited behind them to move only after the first defensive zone was ruptured. Once through, their purpose was not to fight every Romanian strongpoint from the front. It was to enter the rear and make those strongpoints irrelevant. This method reflected lessons the Red Army had learned at terrible cost. Earlier in the war, Soviet counterattacks had often been committed piecemeal and destroyed by German mobile forces. By late 1942, Soviet operational planning was increasingly focused on concentration, deception, and exploitation. German intelligence saw some of the pieces, but struggled to assemble them. The scale of Soviet reserves remained easy to underestimate because the Soviet Union had already lost so many armies. German assessments repeatedly treated previous Soviet losses as a ceiling on future Soviet strength. The Soviet state kept proving that assumption wrong. The quiet flanks were therefore not empty spaces beside the real battle. They were the place where the real strategic decision was about to occur. On the morning of the 19th of November, 1942, Soviet artillery opened fire against the Axis positions northwest of Stalingrad. The bombardment marked the beginning of Operation Uranus. Snow, fog, and low cloud covered parts of the battlefield. Soviet guns struck Romanian positions, command posts, communications, and known defensive areas. After the bombardment, infantry and armored formations moved forward. The Romanian Third Army faced the first great blow. In some sectors, Romanian units resisted stubbornly. Anti-tank teams and artillery engaged Soviet armor. Strong points held for hours. But the Soviet attack was designed to create several penetrations and then send mobile forces through the gaps. Once tanks and mechanized troops reached the rear, the problem changed rapidly. A front-line battalion could still be fighting while roads behind it were already cut. Headquarters lost telephone contact. Supply columns encountered Soviet armor. Artillery batteries discovered that the enemy had passed around the infantry positions they were supporting. The 48th Panzer Corps attempted to respond, but it did not possess the concentrated strength required to restore the line. German and Romanian units counterattacked locally, yet Soviet spearheads continued south and southeast toward the rear of 6th Army. The next morning, the 20th of November, Soviet forces attacked south of Stalingrad against the Romanian 4th Army and neighboring Axis positions. Now the second arm of the encirclement was moving. For 6th Army headquarters, the first reports were difficult to interpret. The city battle had conditioned commanders to think in terms of sectors only a few kilometers wide. Suddenly, the important events were taking place tens and then hundreds of kilometers behind the front line in Stalingrad. Reports arrived from Romanian headquarters, German liaison officers, air reconnaissance, and retreating units. Roads were cut. Soviet tanks appeared near places that had been considered secure rear areas. Supply depots and airfields became threatened. The speed of the operation mattered as much as the breakthroughs themselves. Soviet mobile formations did not stop to destroy every isolated Axis unit. They drove toward operational objectives, bridges, road junctions, and the routes by which 6th Army might retreat west. One of the most important points was Kalach on the Don. Only months earlier, German forces had fought through this area on the way east. Now the same roads and river crossings lay behind 6th Army. Soviet armored troops moved rapidly toward Kalach and captured the important bridge area. The German rear was no longer a secure zone through which an army could simply withdraw in good order. The northern and southern Soviet spearheads approached one another. On the 23rd of November, they met west of Stalingrad. The ring was closed. Inside it were the main body of 6th Army, parts of 4th Panzer Army, Romanian units, Luftwaffe ground personnel, construction troops, supply organizations, and many other formations. The number of people trapped was enormous, far beyond the strength of the combat divisions alone. The scale of the encirclement was not immediately obvious to every soldier. A man in a factory position might know only that Soviet attacks outside the city had become serious. A driver at a supply point might hear that one road west was closed and another was crowded. A headquarters clerk might see staff cars arriving with contradictory reports. At Army Command, the meaning became clearer with each hour. Sixth Army was in danger of being completely cut off from its land supply system. The correct response from a purely operational perspective was obvious to many German officers. Pull out of Stalingrad, concentrate mobile strength, and break west before the Soviet ring became too strong. But an army does not move simply because a line on a map suggests escape. Thousands of wounded men had to be considered. Heavy artillery could not move without fuel and tractors. Supply dumps were distributed across the pocket. Infantry divisions were still engaged with Soviet forces in Stalingrad. Roads were limited. Vehicles had been worn down by months of campaigning. A breakout required immediate decision and preparation. Instead, the decision became trapped inside the German command system. Hitler ordered Stalingrad held. The city, that had become a strategic and symbolic objective, could not be abandoned in his view. Sixth Army was to form a defensive perimeter and wait for relief. The Luftwaffe would supply the pocket by air. This promise transformed the situation. If enough supplies could be flown in, the argument went, Sixth Army could remain in place, while forces outside prepared a counteroffensive. An encirclement would become temporary rather than fatal. German commanders had some experience supplying surrounded forces by air on a much smaller scale. Earlier operations had created confidence in the Luftwaffe's ability to sustain isolated troops under favorable conditions. Stalingrad was not comparable. The number of men was far larger, the distances were greater, winter weather was worse. The available transport aircraft fleet could not reliably deliver the enormous daily requirement of food, fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies. Those limitations were not yet fully accepted at the moment the decision was made. The ring had closed quickly. The consequences would unfold slowly. As the Soviet spearheads drove deeper, the German command faced a problem familiar to every army surprised by a breakthrough. Information arrived slower than the situation changed. A report might be accurate when transmitted and obsolete by the time it reached the next headquarters. A village described as friendly could already contain Soviet tanks. A road ordered for withdrawal could be cut before the order arrived. The breakdown was not complete. German staffs continued issuing orders, and many units fought their way toward new positions. But the command system had been built around a front facing outward from Stalingrad. Uranus inserted Soviet forces behind that front and forced headquarters to rotate their entire understanding of the battlefield. Supply troops suddenly became combat troops. Drivers abandoned trucks when roads were blocked. Workshops attempted to evacuate damaged vehicles before Soviet armor arrived. Airfield personnel prepared defenses. Men whose normal work took place far behind the infantry discovered that there was no longer a secure rear. The seizure of Kalach was particularly serious because the crossing represented more than a bridge. It connected roads on which Sixth Army depended for movement toward the west. When Soviet forces took the area, the German army lost one of the most practical routes by which an organized withdrawal could have been supplied. The closing of the ring on the 23rd did not mean every road and field was instantly covered by an unbroken Soviet trench. Small groups still moved through gaps for a time, But an army cannot withdraw through gaps suitable only for scattered vehicles. It needs corridors wide enough for divisions, artillery, hospitals, and supply columns. That kind of corridor no longer existed. The encirclement around Stalingrad became known to the Germans as the Kessel, the cauldron. At first, the pocket was large. It included the ruins of Stalingrad, sections of the steppe west of the city, several airfields, villages, artillery positions, headquarters, and supply areas. Sixth Army still possessed tanks, guns, and organized divisions. The Soviet ring around it was not yet an unbroken wall of permanent fortifications. This created a brief period in which a breakout remained possible in theory. German officers debated the problem urgently. A breakout would mean abandoning much of the heavy equipment that lacked fuel. Artillery pieces might have to be destroyed. Wounded men who could not travel would face capture. Units would have to disengage from Soviets inside Stalingrad and turn west while under attack from several directions. Yet waiting carried its own danger. Every day allowed Soviet forces to strengthen the encirclement. Every day consumed more fuel and food. Every day reduced the mobility available for a future breakout. General Paulus reported the situation upward. Other senior commanders urged withdrawal or at least freedom to act if the pocket could not be supplied. Hitler refused. Sixth Army was ordered to hold its positions. The command decision cannot be explained by one motive alone. Hitler feared that abandoning Stalingrad would expose the wider southern front. He expected a relief force to restore contact. He believed the Luftwaffe could sustain the army. He also attached enormous prestige to the city. Once the order was given, however, its practical meaning was clear. Sixth Army would not attempt an immediate breakout. It would defend the pocket. The perimeter required reorganization. Units that had been facing east toward the Volga now had to defend west, north, and south as well. Staffs shifted artillery. Supply dumps were inventoried. Engineers prepared positions. Remaining mobile units moved toward threatened sectors. The Soviet forces outside also reorganized. Operation Uranus had achieved the encirclement, but destroying Sixth Army required another stage. The Soviet command had to maintain an inner ring facing the pocket and an outer ring facing German forces that might attempt relief. That distinction mattered. If the Germans outside could break through the outer ring and reach the pocket, Sixth Army might still escape. If the Soviets could hold both rings, the trapped army's supplies would eventually determine the outcome. The German High Command created Army Group Don under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein to manage the crisis. Manstein's task was to restore the front and organize a relief operation. But forces for that operation had to be found and moved across a battlefield already in motion. The Soviet offensive had shattered Romanian formations and opened wide gaps. German units rushed to establish new defensive lines. Railways and roads carried reinforcements toward the Don. Divisions arriving from elsewhere needed fuel and maintenance before they could attack. Inside the pocket, time felt different. At first, rations were reduced, but not yet at starvation levels. Ammunition remained available for defense. The airfields continued operating. Transport aircraft brought in supplies and carried out wounded personnel and specialists. The existence of the airlift created hope. Aircraft landing at Pitomnik or other fields were visible proof that the pocket was still connected to the outside world. But the arithmetic was already failing. Sixth Army needed hundreds of tons of supplies every day simply to maintain combat effectiveness. The exact requirement varied depending on what was counted and what level of activity was expected, but the minimum need was far beyond what the Luftwaffe could deliver consistently. Fuel was especially important. Without fuel, tanks became fixed guns. Trucks could not move ammunition. Tractors could not reposition artillery. A future breakout became less possible every day, even if enough food arrived to keep men alive. The German command, therefore, faced a contradiction. Holding the pocket consumed the mobility needed to escape it. The longer Sixth Army obeyed the order to wait for relief, the less capable it became of helping that relief succeed. Outside the pocket, Manstein prepared the operation that would attempt to solve this contradiction. Its name was Winter Storm. Inside the newly formed perimeter, staff officers also had to decide what the pocket actually contained. Encirclement had trapped more than frontline riflemen. There were construction units, signals personnel, railway troops, Luftwaffe staff, supply depots, workshops, hospitals, and administrative organizations. Each group consumed food and required shelter, even if it did not directly hold the perimeter. The total population, therefore, made every supply calculation larger than a simple count of combat soldiers suggested. At the same time, the army could not simply send non-combat personnel away because the roads were closed. Some were reorganized into defensive units. Others continued the logistical work without which the fighting divisions could not function. The pocket also contained material accumulated for the offensive. Ammunition dumps and stocks of some supplies existed inside the ring. This helped explain why Sixth Army could continue fighting after encirclement. But the stocks were uneven. An army might possess thousands of artillery shells while lacking enough fuel to move the guns that fired them. It might have food at one depot, but no transport to distribute it efficiently. The first weeks, therefore, did not look like immediate collapse. German formations still counterattacked local Soviet penetrations. Headquarters still shifted divisions around the perimeter. The existence of organized resistance encouraged Hitler's belief that holding was possible. What the daily situation concealed was direction. Every successful local defense preserved the pocket for another day, but the pocket was not rebuilding strength. It was spending strength. A static position can create the illusion that time is neutral. At Stalingrad, time belonged to the side with open supply lines. The airlift to Stalingrad began with a promise and became a measure of decline. German transport aircraft flew toward the pocket carrying food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and other essential cargo. On return flights, they evacuated wounded soldiers and selected personnel. The concept was simple. The execution was not. The Luftwaffe had to assemble transport aircraft from across the theater. Many were Junkers Ju-52s, the familiar three-engine transports used throughout the war. Other aircraft types were pressed into the mission as well. Every flight faced distance, whether Soviet fighters, anti-aircraft fire, navigation problems, and the condition of the airfields inside the pocket. Winter weather could cancel operations entirely. Snow and fog reduced visibility. Ice affected aircraft. Short daylight hours limited some missions. Pilots approached fields crowded with damaged aircraft, supply vehicles, wounded men, and units waiting for evacuation. The airfields themselves became critical terrain. Pitomnik, west of Stalingrad, was the most important. Gumrak and other smaller fields also supported operations. As long as usable runways remained inside the pocket, larger transport aircraft could land and unload directly. But aircraft capacity did not match the Army's demand. Sixth Army required hundreds of tons per day. The Luftwaffe rarely came close to delivering the amount required consistently. Some days were better. Some were much worse. Weather could reduce deliveries almost to nothing. The difference accumulated. If an army needs 300 tons and receives 100, the missing 200 tons do not disappear from the problem. Fuel not delivered today means a truck cannot move tomorrow. Food not delivered today reduces rations. Ammunition not delivered today limits artillery later. Inside the pocket, priorities became severe. A transport aircraft could carry food or fuel, but not unlimited quantities of both. Artillery ammunition competed with medical supplies. Winter clothing competed with spare parts. Every cargo decision revealed the shrinking options of the Army. The evacuation flights created another human pressure. Wounded soldiers gathered at airfields, hoping for space. Medical staff had to choose who could be moved. Aircraft that arrived full of supplies could leave with wounded men, but capacity was limited, and the flow into field hospitals continued. The sight of aircraft taking off also reinforced the belief that the pocket might still be temporary. Outside, however, the Luftwaffe was losing aircraft and crews at a rate it could not easily replace. Transport units were being consumed in a mission for which they had never been sized. The airlift also depended on airfields outside the pocket. Soviet advances threatened bases and forced aircraft to operate from greater distances. Longer flights meant fewer sorties and more fuel consumed for each ton delivered. German planners had assumed that air supply could bridge the period until relief. This made the timing of winter storm decisive. If the relief force arrived quickly, even an inadequate airlift might sustain Sixth Army long enough. If relief failed, the airlift could not support the pocket indefinitely. By December, the signs were visible in daily life. Rations fell. Horses were slaughtered for food. Fuel allocations tightened. Vehicles that could no longer be used were stripped for parts. Medical supplies became scarce. The army remained organized, but its material foundation was being consumed. Artillery could still fire, but every shell mattered more. Tanks could still move, but every liter of fuel had to be justified. Aircraft could still land, but every empty space on a returning transport represented someone who would remain inside the pocket. The Luftwaffe did not fail because its crews lacked courage. Pilots and ground crews flew difficult missions in terrible conditions and suffered heavy losses. The failure was structural. The mission required more capacity than the available air transport system could reliably provide. An army of this size could not be sustained by hope, bravery, or occasional good flying weather. It required tonnage. The tonnage did not arrive. The airlift can also be understood by comparing volume with time. A transport aircraft might arrive with a useful cargo, unload successfully, and depart with wounded men. Seen individually, the mission was a success. The pocket, however, did not need successful individual flights. It needed a successful transportation system every day. That system had bottlenecks at every stage. Cargo had to reach the departure airfield. Aircraft had to be serviceable. Crews had to be rested enough to fly. Weather had to permit navigation and landing. The destination field had to remain open. Ground crews inside the pocket had to unload quickly. Trucks then had to distribute the supplies from the airfield to divisions across the perimeter. Fuel scarcity damaged even the final step. A ton of ammunition delivered to Pitomnik was not useful to a battery if there was no fuel to move it to the guns. The Soviet Air Force and anti-aircraft defenses increased the cost. Transport aircraft were slow and vulnerable compared with fighters. Escorts could help, but the Luftwaffe was also supporting ground operations across the front. Every fighter assigned to protect transports was unavailable for another mission. Aircraft losses had consequences beyond Stalingrad. Transport crews were specialists. Training replacements took time. Some aircraft used for the airlift had previously supported airborne training or logistical tasks elsewhere. Their destruction weakened German capability beyond the pocket. The demand for evacuation created a second transportation system moving in the opposite direction. Doctors classified wounded men according to urgency and likelihood of surviving the flight. Men who could walk sometimes waited beside stretchers for an aircraft with space. A weather cancellation did not simply delay a timetable. It meant another day in which the number waiting could grow. The airlift, therefore, became a daily demonstration of the difference between connection and supply. Sixth Army was connected to Germany by air. Messages moved. Officers could sometimes leave. Wounded soldiers could sometimes be evacuated. Cargo arrived. But connection was not enough. The army needed sustained volume, and sustained volume never matched the requirement. On the 12th of December, German forces outside the pocket began the relief offensive known as Operation Winter Storm. The attack came from the south. 4th Panzer Army, under General Hermann Hoth, moved toward Stalingrad with the aim of breaking through the Soviet outer ring and restoring contact with 6th Army. The main striking force included the 6th Panzer Division, recently transferred from the west, along with other armored and supporting formations. At first, the attack made progress. German tanks drove through Soviet positions and crossed difficult terrain under winter conditions. Villages changed hands. Soviet units counterattacked. Bridges and river crossings became important objectives. Inside the pocket, the news created hope. For weeks, 6th Army had been told to hold and wait for relief. Now the relief force was actually moving. The distance between Hoth's spearheads and the southern edge of the pocket began to shrink. But the operation faced two separate problems. The first was the Soviet defense in front of the relief force. The second was Sixth Army's ability to break out and meet it. A successful rescue required coordination from both sides. If 4th Panzer Army alone reached the pocket, it would still have to open and maintain a corridor wide enough to move supplies and possibly withdraw hundreds of thousands of men. If 6th Army attacked outward at the same time, the distance could be reduced and Soviet forces caught between two movements. Plans for such a breakout were discussed under the name Thunderclap. But Hitler did not authorize the abandonment of Stalingrad. Paulus also faced the practical limits of his army. Fuel stocks were low. A breakout would require concentrating vehicles and tanks while leaving much heavy equipment behind. Infantry would have to march through winter conditions after weeks of reduced rations. Wounded soldiers presented an agonizing problem. Every day of delay made the operation harder. Hoth's forces reached the area of the Mishkova River, bringing them to within roughly several dozen kilometers of the pocket at their closest approach. The distance was close enough to seem dramatic on a map. It was not close enough. Soviet resistance increased. Additional formations moved against the German relief force. At the same time, the wider Soviet offensive expanded. On the 16th of December, Soviet forces launched Operation Little Saturn against the Italian 8th Army and neighboring sectors on the Don. This attack threatened the entire German position farther west and placed new pressure on Army Group Don. Manstein could no longer think only about Stalingrad. If the front west of the relief operation collapsed, the forces trying to reach 6th Army could themselves be cut off. The strategic situation was moving faster than winter storm. German armored units continued fighting toward the pocket, but the Soviet command committed enough strength to halt the advance. Inside Stalingrad, 6th Army remained in place. No full breakout began. This decision has been debated ever since. Could 6th Army have escaped if Paulus had moved without permission? Could enough fuel have been gathered? Could exhausted infantry have crossed the distance? Would the army have been destroyed in the open steppe instead of inside the pocket? There is no way to answer every counterfactual with certainty. What is certain is that the chance did not improve with time. By late December, winter storm was stopped. The relief force began withdrawing under pressure. The line that had seemed to be approaching 6th Army moved away again. For the men inside the pocket, the meaning was severe. The promise that justified staying in Stalingrad had failed. The airlift remained inadequate. Fuel was lower than before. Rations were smaller. The Soviet ring was stronger. Christmas approached. There would be no road out. The relief offensive also revealed the difference between approaching a pocket and opening it. As Hoth's armored units advanced, every kilometer lengthened their own exposed supply route. Soviet forces could attack the sides of the corridor or bring new units against the spearhead. A narrow link to Stalingrad would have been difficult to maintain, even if the first tanks reached the perimeter. Manstein's headquarters understood that 6th Army had to contribute. The concept behind a breakout was not simply to save men by marching west. It was to create movement from inside the pocket at the moment the Soviet outer ring was under pressure from outside. But 6th Army no longer had the mobility it possessed in November. Fuel had been rationed for weeks. Some horses had already been slaughtered. Vehicles had been parked to conserve fuel. The wounded population had grown. The army could still fight defensively, but defensive capability and marching capability are not the same thing. The command dilemma became almost impossible. If Paulus began a breakout without permission and failed, he would have abandoned Stalingrad and possibly destroyed the army in the open. If he waited for permission, the fuel required for a breakout continued to disappear. Hitler's refusal resolved the dilemma politically while making it worse militarily. Stalingrad was to be held. Outside the pocket, little Saturn changed Manstein's priorities. Soviet attacks against the Italian Eighth Army threatened routes and forces far beyond the immediate relief corridor. The German command faced the possibility that a continued drive towards Stalingrad could expose Army Group Don to a much larger encirclement. Winter Storm therefore ended not because the relief troops stopped fighting effectively, but because the larger operational situation made continuation increasingly dangerous. For Sixth Army, the distinction offered little comfort. The nearest German tanks had approached and then moved away. No second relief attempt of comparable strength would come. Christmas came to the Stalingrad pocket without changing the military situation. The date still mattered to the men inside. Letters from home, religious services where they could be organized, and memories of earlier winters gave the day personal meaning. But the army remained surrounded, hungry, cold, and under pressure. The failure of Winter Storm removed the strongest source of immediate hope. For weeks, soldiers had been told that relief was being prepared. They had watched aircraft arrive and had heard reports of German armored forces approaching from the south. Now those forces were withdrawing. The pocket would have to survive without a land connection. Rations continued to fall. Horses, which had carried equipment and supplies throughout the campaign, became an important source of meat. Fuel scarcity reduced vehicle movement. Units stripped damaged trucks and tanks for usable parts. Fires used for warmth consumed material that might be difficult to replace. The cold affected everything. Weapons required maintenance. Engines were difficult to start. Frostbite added to the medical burden. Men who were already weakened by poor food became less resistant to illness. The field hospitals faced conditions that grew worse each week. There were too many wounded men and too few supplies. Evacuation by air continued, but only a fraction could leave. The airfields filled with men waiting for flights that might not come. The Luftwaffe still flew into the pocket when weather allowed. Each aircraft brought something necessary and carried away evidence of the crisis. Yet the airlift could not reverse the decline. Sixth Army still existed as a military organization. Orders were issued. Divisions held sectors. Artillery batteries fired. Patrols moved. Staffs kept records and tried to distribute supplies rationally. This administrative normality could hide the speed of deterioration. An army can remain organized while becoming weaker every day. The Soviet forces around the pocket also suffered from winter and combat, but they held the strategic advantage. Their supply lines were on land. They could rotate formations and bring forward artillery for the final reduction of the encirclement. The Soviet command offered terms of surrender in January. German leaders rejected them under orders to continue resistance. For soldiers inside the pocket, the future narrowed. A breakout was now far more difficult than it had been in November. Fuel had been consumed, horses had been eaten, many vehicles were immobile. The infantry had weakened. The idea of simply marching west ignored the Soviet armies between Stalingrad and the nearest German positions. The battle was no longer about taking the city. It was no longer even mainly about holding the city for strategic purpose. It had become a battle for time under orders that offered no realistic path to recovery. Christmas night passed. The fire in a bunker, when fuel could be found, did not make the pocket safe or comfortable. It was only a small circle of warmth inside a larger winter. Beyond the positions, Soviet artillery remained. Beyond the Soviet ring, the German front was moving farther away. The reduction in rations affected military performance in ways that were difficult to measure in a situation report. A hungry soldier could still stand guard, fire a rifle, and obey orders, but endurance declined. Recovery from illness slowed. Small wounds became more dangerous. Long marches or heavy work demanded energy that food no longer supplied. The cold magnified the effect. Winter clothing had not been distributed evenly, and men improvised insulation from blankets, captured garments, and whatever material could be found. Shelters ranged from damaged houses and factory cellars to dugouts in the steppe. Fuel for heating competed with fuel for vehicles, and with wood needed for construction. Disease spread through crowded conditions. Dysentery and respiratory illness weakened men already short of calories. Lice and poor hygiene added to discomfort. Medical personnel could treat some cases, but medicines and clean facilities were limited. The army's horses illustrate the transformation particularly clearly. In the summer they had been part of the transport system, pulling wagons and guns. Inside the pocket, lack of fodder made them difficult to sustain. As food shortages worsened, many were slaughtered. The decision solved one problem briefly and made another worse permanently. Once the horses were gone, the equipment they had moved became less mobile. The same process affected vehicles. A truck without fuel might be cannibalized for parts. Once stripped, it would never contribute to a breakout. A damaged tank might provide a radio or component for another tank, increasing the number operational today while reducing the total that could ever be restored. The pocket was consuming its future to survive the present. In January 1943, the Soviet command began the final reduction of the Stalingrad pocket. Operation Ring opened on the 10th of January with heavy artillery preparation and coordinated attacks against the western perimeter. By this stage, 6th Army was far weaker than the force surrounded in November. Food shortages had reduced physical strength. Fuel scarcity limited movement. Ammunition stocks were lower. Many units had lost experienced officers and non-commissioned officers. The Soviet attack pushed the perimeter eastward. For the Germans, every retreat compressed more men, vehicles, wounded soldiers, and headquarters into a smaller area. The airfields became the most important points on the map. As long as Potomnik remained usable, transport aircraft could land inside the pocket. Supplies could arrive in bulk compared with parachute drops. Wounded soldiers could still leave. That made the airfield a symbol of connection to the outside world. On the 16th of January, German forces lost Potomnik. Its loss changed the airlift immediately. Gumrak became the main remaining field, but it had less capacity and was under increasing pressure. The scenes around the airfields were desperate, even without dramatic description. Thousands of wounded men had accumulated. Medical units attempted to select those most likely to survive evacuation. Aircraft crews had limited space and little time on the ground. The mathematics of evacuation was as unforgiving as the mathematics of supply. Even if every departing aircraft carried wounded soldiers, the number waiting was far greater than the available capacity. On the 22nd of January, Gumrak was also lost. After that, the air connection became far weaker. Supplies could still be dropped from the air, and smaller landing areas might be used briefly under exceptional conditions, but the organized transport system that had sustained the pocket was effectively collapsing. The German perimeter contracted towards Stalingrad itself. This was the final reversal of the campaign. In August, 6th Army had moved from the Don toward the Volga. Now its survivors were being driven back toward the ruins from which they had spent months trying to remove the Soviet defenders. The same city that had been the objective became the last defensive space. Command posts moved into cellars and damaged buildings. Units were combined when their numbers became too small. Heavy weapons were abandoned when ammunition or transport failed. The Soviet command divided the remaining pocket. Northern German forces around the factory district became separated from the southern part centered in the city. Communication between sections became uncertain. The 6th Army headquarters could no longer control the battle as one coherent operation. Hitler continued ordering resistance. He promoted Paulus to Field Marshal on the 30th of January. No German Field Marshal had previously surrendered to the enemy, and the meaning of the promotion was widely understood. Hitler expected Paulus either to continue resistance or to avoid capture. Paulus did neither in the way Hitler intended. By then, the army he commanded no longer possessed a meaningful operational option. The southern pocket was close to collapse. The northern pocket would hold only a little longer. Operation Ring was deliberately prepared as a reduction rather than a dramatic rush into the center of the pocket. Soviet artillery concentrations struck German positions before infantry and armor advanced. The goal was to compress the perimeter, seize airfields, and break the surrounded army into sections that could be destroyed separately. For 6th Army, a shorter perimeter had one apparent advantage: fewer kilometers had to be defended. But contraction also meant losing supply dumps, shelter, airfields, and room to maneuver. Thousands of men were pushed into areas already crowded with hospitals and headquarters. When Potomnik fell, the psychological effect was almost as important as the logistical one. Men throughout the pocket understood what the airfield represented. It was the place from which wounded soldiers might still reach Germany. Its loss turned evacuation from a difficult possibility into a much rarer event. Gumrak's loss completed that change. The remaining air supply depended increasingly on dropping containers, a method far less efficient than landing an aircraft. Some drops fell into Soviet positions or areas German troops could not reach. Others were damaged on impact. Even successful drops provided only a small portion of the Army's needs. The shrinking perimeter also brought command posts under direct threat. Staffs that had worked from buildings behind the front moved into cellars closer to combat. Telephone networks became shorter but more fragile. Units lost contact as Soviet attacks separated them. By the final week, the language of an army still existed, even when the structure behind the words had largely disappeared. Reports referred to divisions and corps, whose effective strengths were fractions of their earlier numbers. Orders assigned missions to formations that could no longer carry them out in the way their names implied. The symbols on the map remained larger than the forces they represented. The final days of 6th Army were fought inside the ruins that had consumed it for months. The southern pocket collapsed first. On the 31st of January, 1943, Soviet troops reached the area of the German Army headquarters in central Stalingrad. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus was taken prisoner. There was no great final breakout. There was no relief force approaching from the west. The command that had entered the campaign as one of Germany's most powerful field armies had ceased to function as a unified army. In the north, German forces around the factory district continued resisting under General Karl Strecker. Their situation was no more hopeful. Food and ammunition were nearly exhausted. The pocket had been compressed into a small area. Soviet artillery and infantry pressure continued. On the 2nd of February, the northern group also surrendered. The organized Battle of Stalingrad was over. The silence that followed did not mean the suffering ended. Roughly 90,000 Axis personnel were taken prisoner during the final capitulation, though figures vary depending on which phases and categories are counted. They joined many others captured during the wider Soviet offensives. Most were already in poor physical condition. The march into captivity and the years that followed were harsh. Disease, malnutrition, exposure, and the conditions of imprisonment killed many. Only a small fraction of those captured at the end of Stalingrad eventually returned to Germany after the war. The German public had been prepared gradually for bad news. When the defeat could no longer be hidden, Nazi propaganda presented 6th Army's destruction as a heroic sacrifice. That language served the regime. It did not explain the decisions that had created the disaster. 6th Army had not been destroyed because its soldiers lacked tactical skill. German units had repeatedly demonstrated the ability to attack and defend effectively. The army had been destroyed because tactical competence could not overcome an impossible operational situation. The summer offensive had divided German strength between the Caucasus and Stalingrad. The battle for the city had consumed infantry and reserves. The Axis flanks had been left vulnerable. Operation Uranus had broken those flanks and surrounded the army. The decision to remain in place had sacrificed the best opportunity for an early breakout. The airlift had never possessed enough capacity. Winter storm had failed. After that, Sixth Army's strength declined until surrender became inevitable. The final surrender also ended one of the strangest command situations of the war. For weeks, Sixth Army headquarters had continued receiving orders from a state that could no longer materially rescue it. Radio linked Paulus to higher command, even when roads and airfields had disappeared. The army was isolated physically, but not administratively. This allowed Hitler to continue influencing decisions deep inside a pocket he could not supply. Orders to hold positions, maintain resistance, and deny surrender arrived through communications that remained functional longer than the logistical system. The contrast is important. Modern command can travel farther than food, fuel, or ammunition. An order can cross hundreds of kilometers by radio in seconds. The resources needed to carry out that order may never arrive. By the end of January, this gap between command and capability was complete. Sixth Army could be told to resist, but headquarters could not create food. It could be told to hold an airfield already lost. It could be told to preserve honor, but honor could not restore a broken division. The promotion of Paulus to Field Marshal was an extreme expression of that gap. The message carried expectation rather than military solution. It asked the commander to respond symbolically to a material catastrophe. Paulus surrendered instead. For soldiers elsewhere in the pocket, surrender came unevenly. Some groups stopped fighting after local negotiations. Others continued until Soviet troops reached their positions. Men destroyed documents or weapons, others simply waited. The northern pocket under Steppe held until the 2nd of February, partly because it remained physically separated from the southern collapse. When resistance ended there, the German Sixth Army of Stalingrad had effectively disappeared from the order of battle. Later German formations would use the Sixth Army name again, but the army that crossed the Don in 1942 was gone. The end was quiet only in comparison with the fighting that preceded it. Captured soldiers were assembled and marched away. Soviet units searched ruins and reorganized. Medical teams faced wounded men from both sides. The city remained a wrecked battlefield filled with unexploded ammunition, destroyed vehicles, and damaged buildings. There was no clean boundary between battle and aftermath. For the Soviet Union, victory could be announced immediately. Recovery would take years. For Germany, defeat could be acknowledged in a radio broadcast. Consequences would unfold across the rest of the war. The defeat also exposed the limits of Hitler's style of command. Orders to hold ground could sometimes prevent premature retreat and stabilize a crisis. At Stalingrad, the same refusal to permit operational movement turned an encirclement into destruction. Paulus has often been judged for obeying those orders too long. Manstein has often been judged for the relief plan and for the debate over whether Paulus should have moved without explicit permission. The Luftwaffe leadership has been judged for accepting an air supply mission beyond its capacity. All of these questions matter, but the disaster was larger than one decision by one commander. It grew from the entire structure of the campaign. The German army had advanced beyond the strength available to secure everything it had taken. It had treated the Soviet Union as closer to exhaustion than it was. It had committed elite formations to an urban battle while the enemy prepared a larger operational counterstroke. And once surrounded, it had allowed political prestige to override military freedom of action. The consequences extended far beyond Stalingrad. German forces in the Caucasus had already begun withdrawing to avoid being cut off by the wider Soviet advance. Axis Allied armies had suffered devastating losses along the Don. The Red Army had demonstrated that it could plan and execute a massive encirclement against a major German formation. The psychological effect was equally important. Since 1941, German propaganda had presented the Eastern Campaign as a sequence of inevitable victories interrupted only by temporary setbacks. Stalingrad could not be explained that way. An entire field army had been lost. Its commander was a prisoner. The city remained Soviet. The Volga remained in Soviet hands. The southern offensive of 1942 had failed. Stalingrad became one of the most powerful names of the Second World War. Its meaning has grown so large that it is easy to let the name replace the history. The battle was not one moment, and it was not one decision. It began with a summer offensive aimed at objectives far beyond the city. It crossed the Don, reached the Volga, moved into streets and factories, and then turned outward again when Soviet armies attacked the flanks. For Sixth Army, the campaign can be understood as a gradual loss of freedom. In June, the army could maneuver across a broad front. In August, it crossed the Don and moved rapidly toward the Volga. In September and October, it exchanged maneuver for possession inside Stalingrad. In November, Operation Uranus removed its land connection to the west. In December, the failure of Winter Storm removed the realistic prospect of relief. In January, the loss of the airfields removed the last organized connection to the outside. By February, the army no longer had anywhere to move. This progression matters because it explains the disaster more clearly than the idea of one sudden defeat. Sixth Army was not destroyed in a single battle. It was trapped by a successful Soviet operation and then consumed by time, hunger, cold, combat, and command decisions. The Soviet victory came at enormous cost. The city had been devastated. Civilians suffered terribly. Soviet armies lost vast numbers of soldiers during the defense, the counteroffensive, and the operations that followed. The victory did not end the war in the east. German forces remained deep inside Soviet territory. Major battles would continue at Kharkov, Kursk, the Dnieper, Belarus, Poland, Hungary, and finally Germany itself. Nor was Stalingrad the only turning point of the global war. In the Pacific, the Battle of Midway had changed the strategic balance months earlier. In North Africa, Axis forces were being pushed back after El Alamein and the Allied landings of Operation Torch. The war was becoming a contest the Axis powers were increasingly unable to win economically or militarily. But Stalingrad marked a clear change on the Eastern Front. The German army had suffered many reverses before, including the failure before Moscow. At Stalingrad, however, a complete field army was surrounded and destroyed, while Soviet forces seized the operational initiative across a broad southern front. The Red Army showed that it could do more than survive German offensives. It could create and exploit operational crises of its own. For Germany's allies, the battle was also a warning. Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies had been asked to hold enormous sectors with equipment and reserves that did not match the demands placed upon them. Their losses weakened the Axis coalition and damaged confidence in German leadership. For the Luftwaffe, the airlift consumed transport aircraft and experienced crews that were needed elsewhere. For the German army, the loss of 6th Army removed formations and experienced personnel that could never be fully replaced. Yet numbers alone do not explain why Stalingrad remains so memorable. The battle compressed the larger war into one place. Industrial power met physical destruction. Modern armies fought inside buildings that reduced combat to a few meters. Aircraft crossed above soldiers fighting in cellars. Tanks that had traveled hundreds of kilometers across open steppe became trapped by rubble and lack of fuel. A river that seemed like the final objective became the supply line that kept the defenders alive. A city that German leaders believed almost captured became the center of an encirclement around the attackers themselves. There is a temptation in telling military history to admire efficiency without asking what purpose it served. The German 6th Army contained skilled soldiers, competent staffs, effective artillery, engineers, and armored units. Those capabilities were employed in an aggressive war waged by Nazi Germany against the Soviet Union within a campaign marked by occupation, racial ideology, mass murder, brutal treatment of prisoners, and enormous civilian suffering. Recognizing tactical skill does not require separating the army from the war it fought. Likewise, understanding the Soviet victory does not require turning the battle into a simple legend. The Red Army made mistakes, suffered catastrophic losses, and demanded extraordinary sacrifice from its soldiers and civilians. Its victory came through endurance, reinforcement, industrial capacity, operational planning, and the ability to identify a weak point in the enemy's larger position. Operation Uranus was the decisive operational act. Instead of continuing to push directly into the strongest German formations inside the city, Soviet planners attacked the flanks. They changed the question from who would hold one more factory to whether 6th Army could continue to exist at all. That is perhaps the central lesson of the campaign. A battle can become so absorbing that commanders lose sight of the front beyond it. A city can feel decisive because every local fight demands attention. A map can show progress while the strategic position worsens. And an army can remain powerful at the point of contact while becoming dangerously weak everywhere around it. Stalingrad was not inevitable from the moment Case Blue began. Different decisions might have produced different outcomes. But by late November, after the Soviet ring closed and the order to remain in place was confirmed, the range of possible endings narrowed quickly. The airlift delayed collapse. Winter storm briefly reopened hope. Neither solved the basic problem. The army had been surrounded farther from secure supply than its remaining strength could overcome. When the final surrender came, the city was quiet only by comparison with what had gone before. Ruins still stood along the Volga. Snow covered damaged roads, weapons, and buildings. The river continued moving beyond the battlefield. The German maps that had once carried arrows towards Stalingrad now showed a gap where 6th Army had been. The larger war continued westward. For the men who survived the pocket, captivity was beginning. For those outside it, new defensive lines had to be built farther from the Volga. For Soviet commanders, victory at Stalingrad opened the next sequence of operations, but did not remove the cost of the struggle still ahead. And for history, the name of the city became shorthand for a campaign in which ambition outran logistics, tactical success obscured operational danger, and a great army advanced until it had nowhere left to go. One final way to understand Stalingrad is to imagine the campaign without the famous names. Remove Paulus, Hitler, Stalin, Chuikov, Manstein, and the names of the factories. What remains is still a recognizable military problem. An army advances farther than its logistical system comfortably supports. It becomes committed to a difficult objective that consumes reserves. Its flanks are held by weaker formations over broad distances. The enemy concentrates against those flanks rather than against the strongest point. The army is surrounded. Higher command refuses an early withdrawal because the objective has acquired importance beyond its immediate military value. An emergency supply method is asked to perform a task larger than its capacity. A relief force approaches, but cannot create a secure connection. Time then does what direct assault alone could not do. It consumes food, fuel, health, equipment, and options until organized resistance ends. That sequence is why Stalingrad has been studied far beyond the history of the Second World War. The details belong to 1942 and 1943. The relationship between logistics, command, maneuver, and time belongs to military history more broadly. The city made those relationships visible because the contrast was so extreme. One of the most mobile armies of the early war ended trapped in a fixed pocket. A force that had crossed hundreds of kilometers could not cross the final distance to its own relief troops. Aircraft that could connect continents could not deliver enough daily tonnage to sustain one surrounded army. And a battle that seemed, from the German side, to be about the last few hundred meters to the Volga became a defeat decided dozens of kilometers away on the flanks. For now, the map can be allowed to become still. The Don lies to the west. The Volga runs past the city. Between them is the road 6th Army crossed in the summer and could not cross again in the winter. The memory of Stalingrad also changed after the war depending on who told the story. In the Soviet Union, the battle became a foundational victory associated with the defense of the city and the great counteroffensive that followed. In Germany, memoirs and post-war studies often concentrated on command decisions, the airlift, and the argument over breakout. Both perspectives can obscure parts of the campaign when treated alone. A story focused only on the ruined city can miss the operational preparation on the flanks. A story focused only on Hitler's refusal to withdraw can make the disaster appear to begin after encirclement, ignoring the summer decisions that created the vulnerable position. The campaign is clearer when those levels are kept together. At the tactical level, German formations often fought effectively. At the operational level, 6th Army became fixed in a city while its flanks weakened. At the strategic level, Germany pursued objectives in the Caucasus and on the Volga, with resources insufficient to secure the whole southern front. The Soviet response worked because it attacked the relationship between those levels. The Red Army allowed the battle inside the city to continue while preparing the force that would strike outside it. This does not make the result simple or inevitable. Soviet planners took enormous risks, and Soviet formations suffered heavily. But the operation succeeded in changing the geometry of the war around Stalingrad faster than German command could adapt. After the war, military schools studied the campaign for lessons about encirclement, air supply, urban combat, coalition warfare, logistics, and command. Those lessons remain connected by one principle: position without freedom of movement can become a trap. Sixth Army held a great deal of ground in November. It held most of Stalingrad. It possessed artillery, tanks, headquarters, and experienced divisions. What it lacked was a secure way to sustain or reposition them once the Soviet armies closed behind it. The battlefield therefore offers a final contrast. In August, German troops reached the Volga and could look west across hundreds of kilometers of territory their army had crossed. In January, many of the same formations were only a few kilometers from that river and could not move even those few kilometers without entering Soviet positions. Distance had changed meaning. The long road across the steppe had become a closed ring around the city. The guns have stopped for this story. The fire can remain for a little longer, and the room can return to silence.